Funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you.
Special agents in the FBI have two contrasting roles to play in the life of the nation. They investigate the worst crimes, but they also have to guard national security. This is the FBI's counterintelligence work. Its aim is the protection of democratic freedom, but it often requires the investigation of political groups. Time and again, this aspect of the Bureau's work has provoked great anger.
As many as 8 agents a day were following me by the FBI. And the FBI itself says there's no record whatsoever I ever thought of doing anything illegal.
They were infiltrating organizations whose leaders they didn't like, whose politics they didn't like. They were a thought police.
I believe the FBI did more damage to the freedoms that we have in this country than any other agency.
The FBI won't say how many of its agents work on top-secret counterintelligence investigations, but Dan James is one of them. His job in Dallas is to catch spies and others who threaten American democracy. In this shadowy world, agents have to strike a very delicate balance. They must protect the nation, but not at the expense of people's hard-won freedoms.
A public agency like the FBI needs the backing of the public, and so long as the public perceives that we are not their enemy, that we are indeed trying to help them, and that we're not out there throwing a chill on their right to assemble or right to express their opinions, then it benefits us if we ever need to come to the public for help. There is a fine line between preventing subversion and protecting civil liberties, civil rights. And as an agency, we simply have to educate ourselves to the fact that there are rules, guidelines, and adhere to those.
In times of tension, when the FBI has to be vigilant, it's all too easy to inflame passion.
Okay, on this one, I want you looking down just a little bit.
In 1991, during the Gulf War, when fears of political violence were high, FBI agents questioned a number of prominent Arab Americans. One, a political activist called David Najab, was encouraging members of his community to vote for the Democratic Party.
Okay, can you keep your head where it is and look right up with your eyes, right? Yeah, that's it. Hold that right
An agent called asking to speak to him about the possibility of hate crimes against Arab Americans. When they met, Najab says he was asked to hand over the names of other political activists in his community.
He told me he wanted the names of these people to get a handle on our community. And a handle on our community was so vague. I asked him, I said, what do you mean a handle on our community? At which time he told me that one of his concerns were terrorist activities being committed. He's told me that to destroy public buildings or to bomb public buildings was a crime, and that if I knew of anyone who was going to destroy a public building or be involved in it, I should contact him immediately. And now rotate the book just slightly. I didn't think being active in a political activity, legal political activity in the United States, was cause for me to be singled out and be told that acts of terrorism were wrong. I know that acts of terrorism were wrong. I don't need the FBI to single me out to tell me that. That's right, that's right. Look right up here. This really was offensive to me. That's good. I was definitely targeted because of my racial origins. The FBI didn't go out and meet with every American and tell them that terrorism was wrong. They met with Arab Americans to tell them that terrorism was wrong.
FBI agents are thought to have visited about 200 Arab Americans during the Gulf crisis. Najab says this had a dramatic effect on the community with roots in a part of the world not noted for its democratic credentials.
Oh, I know exactly what effect it had. In the following election year, we had maybe a fifth of the number of Arab Americans voting and taking part in the political process. It was down, way down, and we had been growing every year from that. It put a chill in our community. Our people were afraid. Many of them come from backgrounds where the government does look into their activities and persecutes them for it. I think the FBI was well aware of that. It killed our political activity at the time.
David Najab is the latest in a long line of political activists who criticize the FBI for interfering in the political process. Over the years, the Bureau has repeatedly come under fire for using its powers to quell political dissent. When communism was the enemy, the critics say constitutional safeguards were ignored and legitimate political careers ruined in a major campaign to undermine the party.
The American Communist Party today is probably virtually irrelevant. It's some kind of a historical vestige, like the tailbone of an animal that no longer has a tail. I think the downfall of the Communist Party was obviously deeply influenced by the fact that it was heavily infiltrated. Probably the most successful operation in the history of the world of placing agents within the ranks of an organization that they deemed hostile.
One reason for the FBI's success was the passionate anti-communism of the man who led the Bureau throughout the Cold War.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
He had a preoccupation with it. Communism, almost say it was a lifelong preoccupation with him. Congress was shared all of his concerns. Indeed, the presidents and the people at large generally supported whatever effort the FBI, whatever Mr. Hoover wanted to do about this particular problem.
The FBI's anti-communist crusade wanted precious resources, but there was little real justification for many of the techniques authorized by its director. Wesley Swearingen was an FBI agent in the 1950s. His job in Chicago was illegally to break into the homes and offices of the leading party members. In FBI jargon, he was part of the black bag team.
This is the kind of briefcase I used in Chicago during our bag jobs in the 1950s, and it contains the necessary equipment to photograph documents, membership lists that we were attempting to locate. Originally, we used the doctor's black leather bag. That's where the term came from. At first, the equipment was almost identical to what we have here, and then as we perfected it, we had metal frames and hinges so that when you opened the briefcase, the camera was automatically set up, and then we would position the lights, and we're all set to go. If anything happened and we would have to leave immediately, we'd close up the case, and you could do that maybe in 5 seconds. When I first started, I was only 25, and I thought it was rather exciting, and I felt that there must have been some secret agreement between the FBI and the Attorney General or the President. Then I found out years later that it was actually illegal, that we did not have authority from anyone but J. Edgar Hoover.
Swearingen says his break-in team was not the only one operating under Hoover's clandestine authority. There were groups of FBI burglars entering Communist Party premises in at least 6 major cities. In his desire to destroy communism, Hoover was sacrificing the very legal principles on which he'd painstakingly built the FBI.
What we were doing was very stupid because we had no evidence whatsoever that the members of the Communist Party in the United States were actually attempting to overthrow the government. They didn't have firearms, and they weren't placing bombs around, and there was almost nothing we could prosecute them for. We were the ones who were violating the law.
In this widespread anti-communist campaign, the FBI disrupted party meetings, discredited communists, and even encouraged employers to fire them. By 1956, there were about 1,500 paid FBI informants inside the party. Such tactics might have been justified if there really had been a violent plot, but there was little connection between the theory of communist revolution and the practice of the American Communist Party.
I mean, we were schooled to understand the nature of the threat and that it was a serious threat. And we began to wonder about it as individuals when we were confronted with the reality of it as we began our life as special agents. The threat obviously was overly drawn. I don't think it was ever a threat. Personally, I don't think it was a threat. I think it was a problem, but a serious threat to undermine the government, I don't think it ever reached that proportion.
I think that the FBI, it was clear why they wanted to infiltrate the Communist Party and other organizations, and it really had nothing to do with any reality that they recognized of these being the source of a violent overthrow of the government by force and violence. At most, the Communist Party represented at its high point, 100,000 members perhaps? And 100,000 out of the millions in the United States are not going, unless they're absolute idiots, are not going to try to overthrow anything. And there was never an example of even the first overt move ever being made.
Hoover's crusade carried on, irrespective of whether there was a real violent plot. What counted most was how effective communists were at championing workers' rights. Bill Albertson, a leader of the New York Party, was one of the best, so the FBI decided to stop him. Hoover gave agents in New York permission to write a fictitious note to make Albertson look like an FBI informer. In June 1964, they had it accidentally dropped in a car used by Albertson. He was expelled from the party and never readmitted.
My husband was a man who was totally involved in his political life, and his expulsion literally robbed him of his manhood. It destroyed him. He really almost wished for death.
The fact behind Bill Albertson's expulsion didn't surface until 1975. The Freedom of Information Act enabled his wife to see the files the FBI had kept on him. By then, he was dead.
My husband had been hounded his entire life for his views and what he believed in, which I think is very wrong. There was never anything criminal that they were able to charge him with. His purpose in life was to fight for the rights of other people. I felt that it was totally undeserved.
I would not want to be a party to any action which would smear innocent individuals for the rest of their lives. We cannot disregard the fundamental principles of common decency
and the application of basic American rights of fair play in the administration of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
It's the most amazing thing as you read and go back over the documents. On one hand, praise on our wonderful American Constitution, on our democracy, and then the deeds that go along with it in total, crass violation of those same principles.
In the 1950s and the 1960s, the House Un-American Activities Committee held hearings to find out if new laws were needed to counteract communist influence.
We're going to get the answer to that question if we have to stay here for a week. Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question. The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I am framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
then
answer
you denied,
to a question
then
which
you,
invades his, absolutely invades
then
his
you
right.
denied,
HUAC, as it was called, was a congressional committee which turned into a witch hunt. Communists were pilloried for their beliefs with the active help of Hoover's FBI.
I have written for Americanism for many years, and I
stand away from the stand.
Fight for the Bill of Rights, which
I
was
will
destroyed.
stand away from the stand.
I really believe that the Un-American Activities Committee was nothing but a front for the FBI, a punishing arm for the FBI. They had very limited research staff. They had very limited, their informers were all FBI informers, as we know today. I dealt with hundreds and hundreds of people called before the Un-American Activities Committee. Time after time, people would say to me, you know, the FBI called upon me, and then it seemed to be 6 weeks to 3 months after an FBI visit that each person was then called before the committee.
The next question.
You have refused to answer the question.
I have not refused. I have not been allowed to finish my answer.
It was only the teamwork between the Un-American Committee and the FBI that made the Un-American Committee so effective.
Hoover's men were even instructed to go after Wilkinson himself, although his campaign to have the House Un-American Activities Committee abolished was legal and constitutional.
I was invited to come in to speak. There probably are 200 different meetings over a period of 20 years, and the FBI had full records of my schedule. They would send a memoranda through to agent in charge in Springfield, Boston, New York, Chicago, saying, here is Wilkinson's travel schedule. And then they would proceed to say, it is your responsibility to disrupt Mr. Wilkinson's speaking engagements.
We will not save free speech. We are not prepared to go to jail in its defense.
Operation Abolition. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Francis E. Walter, Chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities.
Operation Abolition. This is what the communists call their current drive to destroy the House Committee on Un-American Activities, to weaken the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to discredit its great director, J. Edgar Hoover, and to render sterile the security laws of our government.
That is not Ask him the next question. Ask him the next question.
Mr. Lieberman.
Ask him the next question.
Mr. Lieberman.
Wilkinson was twice hauled in front of HUAC. He refused to testify, and in 1961 was jailed for contempt of Congress, joining many others made to suffer for their beliefs. His own FBI files covered nearly 30 years of surveillance that continued even after one agent concluded he had never been a threat to national security.
Now, we estimate the FBI spent $17 million on me from 1942 to 1980. They literally investigated 1 million Americans where the FBI, by their own admission, knew that these people were not violating or even thinking about violating any federal law. This will be known as the J. Edgar Hoover era because of the damage that he consciously did and the people in his employment did. They violated the First Amendment over and over and over again, and for that matter, other parts of our Bill of Rights. There's no excuse for an agency of the federal government sworn to go after criminal investigations to violate the rights of people who are not engaged in criminal activity.
By the late 1960s, the FBI had crippled the Communist Party. Hoover's attention was now focused on other matters. At the top of the list was the new breed of student-led protest movements. One of the most prominent student leaders of the time was Tom Hayden. Today he's a senator in the California State Legislature.
For themselves, our primary struggle is a struggle for our own survival. For our own survival as a movement, for our own survival.
There had never been a youth movement in the United States before. There had never been a student movement. And I think people like J. Edgar Hoover of that generation were taken aback at the thought that there was trouble in America, or people were stirring things up in the United States, because they had been completely conditioned to believe that we were the best society in the world and that all evil really lurked among conspirators abroad.
J. Edgar Hoover celebrates his 40th year as head of the FBI, and there's a simple ceremony in his office to mark the occasion.
Hoover was nearly 70. He'd been FBI director since 1924, and his attitude reflected a bygone era.
It's a happy anniversary for Mr. Hoover.
You see, the FBI is led by a guy named J. Edgar Frico, who happens to be a 70-year-old bachelor who doesn't believe in sex. Now, where's that at, right? So we like run that down to the FBI agents and tell them that like we got free dope, free love, and free rent down the Lower East Side, and they can just drop in anytime they want.
America needs a moral reawakening in every home in our nation. We are courting disaster if we do not soon take some positive action against the growing moral deterioration in this land.
It was just something that the way he had been brought up, that American citizens did not conduct themselves in this fashion. It was just inconceivable to him that this should happen, and he didn't feel it should be permitted. He thought that that element of society running wild in a way. They were creating civil disorder, and this wasn't the way things should be in his mind. I think he felt that if we didn't do something to suppress it, it could get out of control.
Hoover responded much as he had against the communists. By 1969, 1/4 of all FBI agents, backed by 1,000 informants, were investigating student protesters, civil rights groups, and left-wing activists. Most of them were not breaking the law.
And organize them and teaching ourselves that we must arm ourselves. We have to put a shotgun in every door.
The FBI did have good reason to watch the Black Panther Party, a militant response to racism. Their anger sometimes spilled over into violence. But the FBI's concern went way beyond the criminal. Jean Seberg was an actress, not a terrorist, but she did donate money to the Panthers' cause.
She believed in equality. She believed in justice. She believed that she was really going to make a difference in the world. She was always going to be something.
Jean Seberg was married to a French diplomat. In 1970, she became pregnant. The FBI thought it had evidence from a wiretap that the baby's father was in fact a member of the Black Panthers. Hoover had agreed to a plan for the Los Angeles FBI office to leak the information to the press, to tarnish her image with the general public. The memo stated that Seberg was a financial supporter of the Panthers, and so the actress should be neutralized. Hoover asked for a 2-month delay, but within 2 weeks the story appeared in Los Angeles and was then reprinted nationally.
She was a completely different person than she had been the last time I saw her. She was very, very sad, very, very fearful. We were told by her, and we disbelieved it, but she said that our phones were being tapped. We went shopping, and as we were sitting in the store, she said, "That gentleman over there is an agent, and he's watching me." And I said, "You're just imagining that." And she said, "No, it's for real." I don't know to this day whether it was or not, but I'm a little bit more convinced that it probably was.
Seberg went into premature labor soon after reading one of the articles. She said it was caused by the shock. The baby died. The actress blamed the FBI. So did her husband. He said she never really recovered and tried to kill herself each year on the anniversary of the child's death. In 1979, she succeeded in ending her life. The FBI has now admitted it planned to discredit the actress, but insists it didn't leak the letter. The Bureau says it doesn't know how the press got hold of the story.
Well, I know it's true that they leaked the letter because I was on the squad about 2 years afterwards, and I was told by an agent who was on the squad at the time and who listened to Black Panther Party wiretaps on a regular basis for years, and he said that the supervisor of our squad gave it to the liaison agent for the Los Angeles Times. There probably wasn't any written record, but there is a record that Los Angeles asked for permission to do it. There's a record that the Bureau gave permission to do it. The letter was written. There are copies in the file. The letter was published in the Los Angeles Times, so I don't care what they say back at headquarters. The FBI gave the letter to the Los Angeles Times.
Cartha DeLoach was once number 3 in the Bureau hierarchy. He was one of Hoover's closest associates during the search for subversives in the 1960s and still supports Hoover's tactics during this turbulent period.
Yes, it was something not within the framework of the law. It was used very sparingly in an isolated sense, strictly for purposes of trying to protect society.
Doesn't that make you the judge, jury, and the executioner?
No, not when it accomplishes its objective of preventing anarchy or preventing crime, and not only when you advise authorities higher than you are of those matters going on. That takes you out of the situation of being a judge and jury.
But you were still in the position of actually deciding who it was whose opinions you didn't like. Even if they had, if you couldn't convict them on a criminal offense, and you decided, well, they must be neutralized. So
only in instances where it represented a very fertile field for anarchy or crime or violations of the laws of the United States or murder or rape, pillaging, and that's when it was used.
When I was a little girl, I used to think that the FBI was there to protect us and care for the citizens of the United States. And since this happened, I realized that it can be a great danger to people in the United States. It can destroy lives. And it's affected my opinion a great deal.
Toward the end of the 1960s, the FBI began targeting the movement to end the war in Vietnam. As the protest grew in size and violence, the FBI saw it as a growing threat to law and order.
I watched from windows, and I know J. Edgar Hoover did from time to time at the Department of Justice while they were breaking those windows. I watched the mobs going crazily down Pennsylvania Avenue, Constitution Avenue. It's a different situation today as it was back then. To put it crudely, this is a case where you are damned if you do and damned if you don't. The Congress bringing considerable pressure, the FBI trying to operate within a narrow framework, the newspapers bringing considerable pressure, saying, when is this going to stop? President Lyndon Johnson turning to me on one occasion and saying, every time you, meaning the FBI, turning to me and pointing a finger at me, saying, you allow one of these riots to happen, it costs me 93,000 votes. What are you going to do?
Once again, the FBI began disrupting the protesters, few of whose members posed a serious threat to national security. But in 1971, agents uncovered a real conspiracy. Its headquarters was a rundown house in Camden, New Jersey. American combat troops had been fighting in Vietnam for 6 years. In frustration, a group of Catholic anti-war activists decided to break into the local draft board. What the FBI did when it discovered the plan demonstrated how far Hoover would go to discredit the peace movement.
The presence of the draft board was like sort of the claw of the monster would reach down into your home and pluck your son out of it. So it came out of that kind of thinking and an idea that non-violence was the way to go, Gandhi's example and so forth. A lot of that was in it and influenced all of us.
Father, we pray for your holiness to be upon us and that your Son Jesus would be glorified. We ask you, Lord,
Bob Hardy was a member of the protest group. He was also an FBI informant. Hardy opposed the war, but the break-in plan had plagued his Christian conscience, so he had decided to tell the Bureau.
I personally am against the breaking of the law, and when they were willing to break the law in the dark of the night, to break into a building, into a federal building, I felt that they did not know what they were getting into.
Instead of stopping the break-in, the FBI told Hardy to use his practical experience as a builder to make sure that it actually took place. Hoover wanted to make an example of the protesters.
They asked me to teach them how to climb a ladder without falling off, how to open a window and climb through a window, which sounds easy enough unless you've never done it before. We taught certain members of the group how to remove glass from a window without breaking it or making noises, and gave them the tools for it. I felt like the Pied Piper, leading them down a merry path over to the cliff. They had no talent at all when it came to the physical stuff of this world. Within our community, they would be referred to as so filled of heavenly thoughts that they were no earthly good.
The anti-war conspirators walked into a trap. The FBI had the building carefully staked out on the night they decided to break in.
Each person had a little bag with tools, and just with the pry bar opened the window into the draft board. We then started on tearing up the draft records, and it was like tearing up manila folders. It was tough, hard work, and we just kept tearing then for about 2 hours.
The FBI now had the protesters exactly where it wanted them. 3
FBI agents jumped me and pulled me to the floor, and then they took my belt and tied my hands behind my back, and then they brought us over and laid us on the floor in a row on the ground.
Most of the activists were charged with breaking into and destroying government property and 5 other offenses. The maximum sentence they faced was 47 years in prison. It looked like a major coup for the FBI until Bob Hardy took the stand.
In The defense lawyer brought each tool to the table and asked me where they came from, whether from the FBI or was it the defendant's own tools. And as I identified each tool, the pile was immense on the FBI supply side, and over here was maybe like a little handsaw or a butter knife or some insignificant thing that had nothing to do with the break-in at all.
All the conspirators were acquitted. The jury clearly believed that Hardy had been used as an agent provocateur, that without the FBI, the break-in would not have occurred. The FBI agents even told Hardy why this had been done.
Obviously, I questioned my agents that I made my contact with each day, and they told me that the decision was made at the Little White House in California, which involved Mr. Nixon and Mr. Hoover, that they made the decision to get more evidence so that they could put these folks away for life. They wanted to destroy this political left.
There's a delicate balance between doing what you need to do to protect citizens and yet not going so far in that you're overly intrusive. It's a difficult balance to achieve, and I think during those difficult days of the Vietnam War, obviously in some instances the effort became out of balance. Hoover himself greatly exaggerated the real nature of the problem.
Do you feel the nation is in trouble?
I think very definitely it is.
In what respect?
In respect to that it has these conditions existing, these riots, these lootings, and this burning and arson of buildings and stores in various parts of the country that should not be allowed to prevail.
Well, what is the answer?
The answer is vigorous law enforcement.
That's the only answer?
That's the only answer.
How about justice? You hear a lot about justice with law enforcement.
Justice is merely incidental to law and order. Law and order is what covers the whole picture.
I don't know if J. Edgar Hoover read the American Constitution in its entirety and in its complexity, because he certainly emphasized exclusively the provisions having to do with order. And if you try to impose order with no concern for justice, the question arises, order on behalf of what principles? And Hoover's response was his principles, which were God's principles, which were America's principles. This was insane thinking. Hoover's a case of the abuse of power in extremis in the 20th century in one of the most, if not the most, democratic societies in the world. Hoover is the evidence of some profound flaw in American democracy, that I can't account for it. I don't know what people were doing. I don't know what our past presidents were thinking.
Successive presidents either weren't told about or just ignored Hoover's tactics against political dissent. They allowed the FBI to use aggressive and even illegal methods that went far beyond the prevention of violence. They let Hoover's agents undermine a generation that passionately disagreed with government policy. In 1971, Hoover abruptly shut down much of his domestic counterintelligence program. He did so after another politically motivated robbery. This time, the conspirators were after secret FBI intelligence documents. They stole 1,000 of them from a small bureau office in Media, Pennsylvania, and leaked them to the press. There was the scout leader investigated for wanting his troop to visit Russia, the congressman's daughter spied on for opposing the Vietnam War, the names of all the FBI's informants in a nearby college. Hoover's very personal campaign against political dissent had been laid bare. It was a watershed for the FBI.
Citizens began to read about some of these strange goings-on with the government. And Hoover and his immediate staff was concerned over, you know, there's liable to be more of these break-ins, there's liable to be more of these sensitive secrets or sensitive programs get out and get loose. The genie was out of the bottle, so to speak. And again, kind of a typical overreaction to the problem. Close up all the small offices around the country. I was agent in charge of the state of Michigan, and the idea of closing down all these offices which were needed to protect the nation and its citizens, or closing any number of them, or any of them for that matter, was just insane. And yet that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to just go out of business, close up, you know, let's bottle everything up.
Mr. Hoover has reached the point where he can no longer serve effectively in that agency. We desperately need a new director. The president...
After Hoover's death, a congressional committee condemned the FBI for taking the law into its own hands and conducting a vigilante operation against those it defined as enemies.
We are truly sorry that we were responsible for instances which are now subject to such criticism. Some of these activities were clearly wrong and quite indefensible. We must certainly never allow them to be repeated. We recognize errors and have learned from them.
A new rule was introduced. The FBI now had to have firm evidence of a crime before it could open similar investigations. But a few years later, there were complaints that the Bureau was once again breaking its promises.
The recent elections there unmasked the lie that there is popular support for Marxism in that country.
In the early 1980s, a group called CISPAS began organizing protests against President Reagan's policies towards El Salvador.
FBI agents and supervisors working on this particular matter believed, through an informant and some corroborating information, that there was a strong basis to believe that the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, commonly called CISPAS, was an organization that was not only advocating a change in U.S. policy, but was engaged in terrorist activity.
The best way to neutralize a group was to infiltrate it. There was no doubt that we needed to infiltrate CISPAS. For that reason, the person of Gilberto Mendoza was created. He was provided, with a false Social Security, a false driver's license, and all of that served as a cover, as a legend, what it's called, it's a legend, to create this person who was going to go into CISPAS.
And that person was you?
Yes, that was me.
Borelli's target was a CISPAS group run from a small Catholic church on the outskirts of Dallas. The organization had a broad membership that included lawyers, school teachers, and students. It was run by two nuns who organized demonstrations and speeches against the sending of American military aid to El Salvador. They said they first found out the FBI was spying on them when they read about it in a newspaper.
That was a pretty dirty trick.
It was a dirty trick.
Yeah.
It was a dirty trick.
For one thing, we felt like, gosh, here, all of the FBI has been spending all this time and energy on us. It was really kind of humorous almost. On the other hand, I think a lot of us were really very angry at the sense of the violation of our right to speak publicly, the violation of our rights to assemble freely. It was a crime in some sense what they were doing to us.
Varelli claims he not only spied on them, but also took part in an aggressive campaign designed to undermine the effectiveness of CISPAS as a protest group. He believes it was a campaign with echoes from an era that should have been dead and buried.
The FBI took the decision to go with the investigation in a more, active way, harassing these individuals by going to their landlords and telling them that they were associated with a terrorist organization, so they will be kicked out of their apartments. We started to intervene their mail, whenever possible, taking it out of mailboxes, and also whenever there was an opportunity, putting nails through the tire in their cars whenever they were meeting, harassing them, letting them know that they were under surveillance and that this time we meant business.
Did you do this, or did the agents tell you that they did this?
They did some, I did some, because we were all, working, we were all involved in this.
Varelli says he did all he could to confirm the FBI's suspicions about the group. He had every reason to. He was a right-wing El Salvadoran who opposed everything CISPAS stood for.
We were gathering information for the sake of gathering information, but we were not getting anywhere. And I got to see that we were just, involved practically. We had become what I call government vacuum cleaners. We were collecting all the dirt that was, supposed to be spread in the CISPAS groups, but we were collecting information of people that didn't have anything to do with, exactly with the guerrilla movement. I did not find links at all between terrorists and people here working in the CISPAS groups.
Varelli appeared before a congressional inquiry and repeated many of his allegations. His credibility was at stake. He'd already taken an FBI lie detector test, which showed him to be truthful. But the FBI now disputes the results and virtually everything else that Varelli says.
Many of the things that he stated to Congress are simply not true and provably not true. I stated that when I testified before the Congress many years ago. So Mr. Varelli's veracity, and one of the problems we had in the case was the fact that he proved to be a disseminator of false information. He had a personal agenda, and he proved to be an agent of disinformation.
Well, he says the agent that was working with him actually broke into the CISPAS office and took a document.
He can say anything he wants. There's no evidence of proof of that, and the agent categorically denies it, and we have no evidence that that occurred whatsoever. Mr. Varelli is a liar. The FBI did not intimidate CISPAS at any time during this process. They were free to continue their dissident activities, their outspoken opposition to our support of El Salvador. So nothing the FBI did in any way intimidated those who were espousing that particular political view.
I guess I could believe anything of what they're capable of, how far they can push the lines of what's proper. I guess having seen them push those lines very, very far, I could believe they could do that again. So I have real mixed feelings about the FBI. It seems like that edge of the law should be a real edge, not a smooth rock that gets kind of pushed here and there, but an edge. This you can do, this you cannot do.
No member of CISPAS was ever prosecuted, despite a 2.5-year investigation of more than 2,000 people that involved most of the FBI's field officers. Critics accused the FBI of using the discredited tactics of the Hoover era. They claim the new rule designed to limit counterintelligence investigations to criminal matters had failed because it didn't apply to groups like CISPAS that had contact with foreigners. They want this loophole closed. The FBI strongly disagrees.
I think that potentially we would have a number of crimes committed, including espionage and certainly terrorism, that we would not prevent by prevention, that we would not be able to detect before the act was committed. We would essentially be responding to the bomb after it had been detonated, not before. We've been very successful in the United States staying within the confines of our constitutional requirements and guarantees to prevent more acts of terrorism than have occurred in the United States. That has been somewhat unique in the Western world, that we have balanced the rights of the individuals against the needs of the state, the needs of the public, and have found that proper balance and have yet prevented more terrorism than has actually occurred.
Whether the FBI has truly become a guardian of liberty is open to question. Individual freedoms are often threatened during periods of political upheaval. Critics say that without a tightening of the rules, history seems bound to repeat itself.
There's one simple thing that needs to be done. Congress must pass a law telling the FBI that their only function is to investigate violations of federal criminal statutes. If that law is passed, we'll have the protection we need. But my realism tells me, in my life, that within 5 years after such a law is passed, some other congressperson will come along and try to repeal that law to let the FBI go back and do what it used to do. So I think the summary of my experience is that to protect freedom in your country, you have to exercise what I love from Jefferson. Eternal vigilance is the price of our freedom.
This program was produced by Connaught Films Limited for Channel 4 and for WETA, who are solely responsible for its content. Funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. To order a video cassette of Inside the FBI for educational use only, call 1-800-328-PBS1 or write to the address on the screen.
This is PBS.
Next on Inside the FBI, finally, a move against the Mafia.
Sam Giancana probably was the guy that I had more disrespect for than any other mobster in the history of Chicago. He was just the worst kind of a thug. I've had at least 50 confrontations with Sam Giancana. He killed 13 people that we could document by his own hands. We just hated each other.
Romer and 3 other agents were sent on a clandestine mission to bug Sam Giancana's headquarters. With Hoover's blessing, the 4 FBI agents became 4 FBI burglars.
We had heard that there was a guard inside with a shotgun, and he'd have every valid reason to shoot us as we came in.
Giancana held his meetings in a room in the back of a restaurant on the outskirts of the city. The agents had tricked a janitor into giving them a key. In the dead of night in August 1961, they crept into the building to plant the microphone they hoped would lift the lid on the Mafia.